if we were just to look at East Africa and Kenya, for instance, and the huge privatization drive, there's a heavy emphasis on the railways because they see that as a strategic imperative. What's the approach across Africa? My sense is that that's not quite the way they see rail.
Good afternoon, Lerato. A lot of countries are being encouraged to invest in rail because railway infrastructure opened up Africa in the 19th century, and there's a great deal of affection, often not rationally based these days, for railways because they have successfully made these countries what they are. However, as the experience in Tanzania and Kenya has recently shown, railways can be disasters as well as great benefits to an economy, and the Tanzanian and Kenyan railways have collapsed, not through the direct role of the government, but they have attempted to restructure their railways through a public-private partnership. And what appears to have happened is that the value proposition was not looked into properly. It was just assumed that a railway solution would be the right one, that a public-private partnership could renovate these railways, make them what they were before. But that's not been the case. The value was not looked into properly.
All right, value propositions in South Africa, I know that the emphasis is on roads, but increasingly as we're talking about exploring new markets north of the Zambezi, rail becomes a strategic imperative because it almost seems to be the most efficient way of freighting. And if we're not looking at passenger services, certainly when we talk about regional integration and getting goods to markets across the various regions in SADC, that seems to be the option.
Well, what you say, Lerato, is precisely the man or woman in the street's view, that rail must be the cheaper, the more strategic option. But the reality is that it's not. I've just done some research 2 years ago for the National Department of Transport that looked at the role of railways in the national economy of South Africa for the last 130 years. And what we discovered was that for the first 30 or 40 years, railway opened up the country efficiently. But once the new transport technology emerged, the technology of motorized road-based transport, you found that the road-based investment had a much stronger impact on economic development than railway investment did. Now, this is simply a role of a relationship of technology. What road transport does is it facilitates economic activity in a lot more locations at lower cost. Rail transport remains excellent for very high bulk, but the reality is, and this is a lesson that I think is going to be learnt the hard way in Africa, that road transport's benefits are not in the cost of transport. It is higher cost than rail, but it's in the way that it opens up economic opportunities.
So what do we do with all the railway lines that exist? Because, for instance, when people look at connecting a port like Richards Bay to Mozambique, to other neighboring states, they're looking at rail as a freighting option.
Well, you mentioned Richards Bay, and in South Africa we've got a very successful railway from Richards Bay to Ermelo for exporting coal. It could be even more successful if managed more efficiently, but it's exactly the right role for rail. The issue is using the right technology for the right products. General freight does not operate successfully on rail because most of the benefits are not related to the transport cost, but to the economic activity that is facilitated by the transport. Rail is good for bulk, but not for general freight.
Okay, let's bring in our guest host, Nyagaka. I'm not going to turn you into a transport engineer, but nonetheless, we're told that road investment shows a stronger impact on GDP growth than rail. I mean, for investors coming into Africa, banging on about the need to improve on infrastructure, do they really care whether it's rail or it's road, or do they just want to see things working effectively and efficiently?
I think they do care because, you know, it's interesting as I anecdotally think about some of the work that we're doing in financing infrastructure projects across Africa. There's quite a bit of interest in some of what the road authority is actually proposing. Right. Obviously quite a bit of interest in other infrastructure areas, like, for example, electricity generation, but not as much interest and not as much activity on the rail side. And I think part of that has to do with the robustness of the revenue model, as Mr. Marsay has indicated. Okay,
let's talk about the revenue model for rail. You've obviously started to argue a case that it isn't very cost effective and it doesn't bring a lot more profits to the investor. What's wrong with the rail concessioning model, whereas the roads seem to work well? What's the problem with the rails?
Well, Lerato, the problem is not really with the concessioning model. It's what the concessioning model is being used to do. A public-private partnership is not a magic wand to create value where there's no value. It's an efficient procurement method. And if it's applied to a good value proposition, it'll work. If it's not, it won't. What's happened with many of the PPPs for rail is that an assumption has been made that once the railway is there, the punters, the road operators will immediately come to rail, but they don't. The reason is that even if the roads are bad, even if the road costs 3 times as much point to point as the rail, the road operator retains control over his consignment all the way through, and he can deliver it right to his customer. I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine was responsible for a big project, a pipeline project in Zimbabwe, in the last decade. And his job as a freight forwarder was to determine how to bring the pipes from overseas to the project. The project was moving on kilometre after kilometre every day. If he'd used rail, which he would have liked to have done, he would have had to take it to the nearest rail depot and then trucked it to the wherever the project was at the time. It would have taken a week or 10 days longer, and the project would have lost huge value in the interim. Even if the transport cost was cheaper, the project lost far more value than any gain in using rail.
All right, well, South Africa has introduced its new industrial policy action plan, and it's really to sort of fast-track economies of scale in South Africa and to get goods to market within the SADC region to create 2 million jobs, etc. That's just basically simplifying the text. And if, in looking at efficiencies, rail was to be compared to others, there is an argument that rail could boost the manufacturing sector in this economy if we were to think about producing locomotives for the rest of the African sub-region. If we're to look at that particular issue, we would create another niche industry where we could create jobs.
Sadly, that's not true. If you build an industry to support an industry that's not economically viable, you'll be putting money into a black hole. If rail were economically viable, then to build locomotives locally would be a fantastic thing to do. To build locomotives perhaps for bulk exports, like our iron ore and coal lines, are viable in and of themselves. But our general freight line is not viable in and of itself. It requires the soft financing that is entailed within Transnet's monopoly access to funding because of its ownership of the ports and the pipelines. Now, to keep on putting money into an industry which is not in itself economically viable, which is general freight railway, whatever else you attack onto it, you will actually be weakening the economy, not strengthening. Now, that seems irrational to many people because there's a general gut feeling in many people's minds that rail is good, road is bad. And all I'm saying is that look at things case by case. Rail is good for bulk. Rail is good for very high volumes of containers. In America, for example, where rail is profitable, they have a benchmark. They say double stack containers over 1,000 miles with private ownership of the operations and infrastructure, we make money. And Warren Buffett, the great entrepreneur, invests in rail.
I'm glad you've just mentioned that. He's a value investor, and he invests in rail, for instance, and he sees that long term as going to have dividends. Now, it may be peculiar to what's happening in the United States, but when people look at the fact that port facilities in Africa are very poor, airports are really very poor, roads are in a dilapidated condition, but what we do have as a legacy of history are railway lines which could just be refurbished. Why not?
Yeah, but also keep in mind that the U.S. experience has been somewhat different. I mean, if you go back about 100 years, and Mr. Marsay can probably vouch for me on this, there were proliferation of railroad companies in the U.S. There's been a lot of consolidation in the U.S. in the course of the last 20 years. And what you're seeing now is you're seeing some brand names that have primary routes across the U.S. that are very profitable, as Mr. Marsay has actually said. But overall, if you look at the rail industry in the U.S. as well, just from a financial metrics perspective, it's still, from a credit perspective, a triple B, double B plus type industry, relative to other industrials that are single A, double A type industries.
Okay, now we've been talking obviously about rail freighting services. Let's talk about passenger rail, because apparently that's really where a lot of money has been lost in the black hole, particularly in this economy. But the Gau train, it seems to be doing well. Seems being the operative word.
Gautrain's doing well from a technical operational point of view. It's not a good project financially. It's had a 95% government grant. It'll probably cover its operating costs fully once it's operating. But the economic case for Gautrain has got nothing to do with transport economics. It's that it is linking together the already growing urban nodes of the Gauteng metropolitan area. And the benefit that you're purchasing with Gautrain is urban efficiencies, urban economic development. Gautrain is, as it were, riding a wave of already existing urbanization and urban economic growth. One only needs to go to Santon Station here and look across the road and see the investments in the Gautrain Hotel on the old Mutual site. Everywhere investment is pouring in to these nodes. So the urban case for passenger rail can be quite strong, but it's not based on the transport costs, it's based on the support which the railway gives to the urban economy.